In the height of summer, the sun rises around 5 or 6, casting a vibrant glow on the city's edge. By noon, the scorching sunlight, reflected off glass curtain walls, becomes utterly unavoidable. Jiang Yunxia had attended interviews at 5 law firms that morning, all with unsatisfactory results. During her lunch break, she listened absent-mindedly to her friend complaining about the company's demanding conditions for unpaid interns while inserting coins into a vending machine. In the ensuing clatter, as she reached for her drink, her resume slipped from her grasp. The pencil skirt felt like a modern-day binding cloth for women, suitable only for standing still like a statue and ill-suited for any other activity. As she carefully pressed down her skirt to squat down, a hand reached out in front of her. The elegant wrist bone partially exposed under the pristine, crisp cuff swiftly picked up the fallen resume. The dazzling sunlight blurred her vision as Jiang Yunxia stood up and bowed her head. "Thank you." However, the person didn't seem inclined to return her resume. Annoyed by such a cliched pickup tactic, Jiang Yunxia raised her head. "Excuse me." The next moment, it felt as if she was choked. How could it be him? The man in front of her stood tall. Even with her high heels, she only reached his chin. At that moment, backlit by the sun, his sharp phoenix eyes glanced impatiently, exuding an oppressive aura. Her heart skipped a beat, almost like a precursor to heatstroke. "Sorry, Jiang Yunxia was at a loss, not knowing what to say. She wanted to ask when he returned to City A and why he hadn't come back to the apartment if he was back. But she dismissed these questions before voicing them. What right did she have to ask? "Take it." The flat voice sounded above her, the icy tone laced with impatience. Jiang Yunxia snapped out of her daze, quickly took out her drink from the vending machine, and reached for the resume in his hand. Without another glance at her, the man walked away with his companion. It was as if he didn't recognize her at all. On the other end of the phone, her friend was still ranting, and Jiang Yunxia responded haphazardly, her mind in turmoil. This confusion lasted into the afternoon's interview. Her distraction was so evident that even the interviewer noticed, teasing her. "Miss Jiang, are you daydreaming because you think you're so excellent that getting a position at Yuntu is a piece of cake?" Yuntu was one of the top law firms in City A. She had only applied on a whim and was thrilled just to get an interview. How could she be so confident as to feel no pressure? Yet she managed to mess up even this opportunity. Returning dejectedly to her residence, a spacious and minimalistic apartment on the top floor of a building, maintained clean by weekly cleaning services, felt devoid of life. She removed her shoes at the entrance and tiptoed barefoot across the hallway to her bedroom, where she finally collapsed on the bed. Then she thought of him again. It's been 4 years. When did he return to the country? She hadn't heard a thing. No news. Never returned to this apartment. Was it because she had taken over? He still hated her so much. When Jiang Yunxia first met Jian Xiaodong, she knew he disliked her. In the solemn, stark white morning hall, she was pushed in front of him. At that time, she was just a small child, barely reaching his waist, looking up at him timidly. The young man stood tall and imposing, exuding an aura that warned people to stay away. In the backlight, she saw his thin lips pressed together without a hint of warmth. As they left, she instinctively reached out to hold his hand, but he merely shifted slightly, avoiding her touch without a word. None of the grieving relatives in the hall noticed this small episode, but she stood frozen, looking at her own hand, the embarrassment washing over her like a tidal wave. But in the end, he still took her in, this little burden. Jiang Yunxia carried an old backpack and followed him all the way to the top-floor apartment of a building. The young man's residence was minimalistic and cold-toned, clean yet spacious. She looked down, watching her old leather shoes leave dusty footprints on the smooth marble floor. It seemed as though there was no place for her here, even though she was such a thin, frail little thing, with all her belongings packed into one old backpack. "You'll sleep there." He poured himself a glass of water at the kitchen island, pointed out a room for her, and then left her alone in the empty living room, heading back to his own room. The unfamiliar environment and the fear of the future plunged her into endless nightmares that night. As she was endlessly falling into the darkness, a cold hand woke her. He stood by her bed, frowning at her. "You're noisy." He had a pair of narrow phoenix eyes, a classical and elegant shape, but when he frowned, his gaze was sharp and indifferent. But there was no denying that he was handsome, a beauty as cold as the moon seen through the skyscraper's floor-to-ceiling windows, with no warmth at all. "Sorry." She lowered her head timidly, cold tears sliding down her cheeks, gathering at her pointed chin. He stared at her coldly for a while, pressed his lips together without a word, but then, as if possessed, he reached out his hand. That drop of tear fell into his palm, icy to the bone. Jiang Yunxia was stunned for a moment by this sudden gesture. She looked up at him. In her blurred, tearful vision, the young man's face appeared somewhat gentle. "Brother," she couldn't help but say timidly. She was very scared, desperately needing someone to rely on, so she mustered the courage to ask, "Can I call you brother?" The room was silent. The young man in front of her smiled silently, the curve of his lips sharp as a blade. "No," he said, each word cold and ruthless. "Jiang Yunxia, remember this. You and I will never have any relation in this lifetime." The indifferent eyes from her memory overlapped with those under the office building today. She buried her face in the pillow. "It's time to find another place to move out, isn't it?" He's back, and she is no longer the little orphan with nowhere to go. A few days later, Jiang Yunxia received a call from Yuntu. She had moved to a new place and was busy unpacking her belongings. What used to be just a small backpack had grown into several large cardboard boxes over the years. On the other end of the line, the caller said, "Miss Jiang, congratulations on passing the interview. Can you start next Monday?" Jiang Yunxia was momentarily stunned, nodding repeatedly before quickly replying, "Yes, I can." After hanging up, she flopped onto her bed, ecstatic. She had no idea that on the other end, the HR representative turned to ask Lawyer Chen, "Why did you go through so much trouble? Did you take a liking to her, Lawyer Chen?" Lawyer Chen looked around, making sure Jian Qiudong wasn't there, then smiled and said, "I saw Lawyer Jian helping her pick up some documents downstairs that day." Lawyer Jian. Linda was also surprised. "Yes, strange, isn't it? That guy is usually a minding my own business kind of cold-blooded man." She nodded, surprisingly in agreement. Thanks to Lawyer Chen, the gossip had already spread throughout the firm before Jiang Yunxia even started. When she reported to work on Monday, she felt the curious gazes of her colleagues, but didn't think much of it. Linda introduced her to various departments and finally led her to an office door, knocking. "Lawyer Jian, I've brought the new assistant." Before Jiang Yunxia could understand the strange tone in Linda's voice, the door opened. She looked up, her uneasy eyes meeting the man behind the large desk. Her mind went blank, and before she could say anything, Jian Qiudong frowned. "Why is it you?" There couldn't have been a more awkward reunion. Jiang Yunxia thought. Jian Qiudong had always been impatient with her. He disliked her so much that even being in the same room made him unhappy. She was young back then, but she already understood how to read people's expressions. Knowing he didn't like her, she tried to appear in front of him as little as possible. She would leave for school before he woke up and stay in her room after coming home, sometimes not seeing him for months. After changing schools, she got harassed by some thugs outside the school, but luckily, a patrolling officer saved her and took her to the police station. When asked to call a guardian, she could only give his number. He arrived at 11 at night, and the police, seeing how young he was, questioned his identity. "For once," she lied. "He's my brother. Our parents are away on a business trip." She didn't dare look at him, afraid of seeing his disgust. Leaving the station, he glanced down at her, his long eyes filled with impatience. "You're even more stupid than I thought." She could only mutter, "I'm sorry." But the next day, a driver from the Jian family started picking her up and dropping her off at school, rain or shine, until she finished her college entrance exams. He probably didn't want to have to go to the police station a second time, Jiang Yunxia thought. After work, when everyone at the firm had left, Jiang Yunxia lingered at her desk for a long time before finally getting up to knock on his office door. He was still there, reviewing documents. Seeing her, he asked coldly, "What is it?" "Sorry." She lowered her eyes, staring at the carpet's pattern. "I'll explain to HR. I won't come to work tomorrow." He said nothing, his eyes still on the documents. Jiang Yunxia bit her lip, just about to leave when she heard him say calmly, "I thought you would understand to respect other people's time." She was stunned. "What?" "HR hired you for a reason. Quitting on your first day is wasting their time." Jiang Yunxia stood there, speechless, looking at him. The man still wore a cold expression, but she suddenly felt a strange sensation. It was almost like he was asking her to stay. She stood there for a long moment. Jian Xiaodong finally looked up, coldly saying, "Anything else?" Jiang Yunxia shook her head, inexplicably wanting to laugh. "No, I'll be going." She took a couple of steps but then remembered something. Turning back, she gathered her courage. "By the way, I've moved out. I left the keys with the property manager. You can go back." He looked up at her, his gaze deep and complex, with emotions she couldn't decipher. "Got it." After a moment, he responded impatiently. Jian Xiaodong turned on the light, illuminating the living room. He closed the door behind him and walked into the apartment he had not seen in a long time, only to find that nothing had changed since he left. The magazines he had casually left on the coffee table before going abroad, the models on the partition shelf, and the scarf draped over the back of the sofa were all in the same place. He didn't like others touching his things. When she first moved in and tried to clean and organize, he had snapped at her, and she never dared to touch his belongings again. Thinking about the small, timid figure that always seemed to be afraid, he felt an inexplicable irritation. Opening the door to her room and finding it empty and tidy only intensified his frustration. After graduating from college and breaking off with his father, he had moved out in a fit of anger and bought this apartment. Who would have thought that he would end up sharing it with the daughter of that woman? She had a beautiful face, gentle and pure, much like her mother, the woman who had been the white moonlight in his father's heart, someone he could never forget, even after she married someone else. It was that gentle, pure face that had fueled his mother's lifelong resentment, and as a result, he had hated that woman as a child and had little fondness for her daughter, who looked so much like her. So, why had he stopped her from quitting? Unable to answer his own question, Jian Xiaodong closed the door, his gaze falling on the floor-to-ceiling windows. The night was deep, and the glass reflected the bright lights of the room. The next day, Jian Xiaodong arrived at the firm on time. Passing by the new assistant's desk, he noticed it was empty. Frowning, he walked into his office. After meeting a few clients and organizing case files, he came out at noon. His colleagues were arranging lunch, and that desk was still empty. He couldn't describe his feelings, but after frowning at it for a while, he called someone over. "Clear that desk." Turning to leave, Linda called after him. "Hey, isn't that a bit harsh, Lawyer Jian?" She continued. Xia asked for leave. She broke her leg, which isn't her fault. Isn't firing her a bit much? Jian Xiaodong stopped in his tracks and turned back. Broke her leg? Jiang Yunxia, with her ankle in a thick cast, struggled to hold onto the railing as she made her way to the hospital washroom, clutching her phone. "No, really, you don't need to come. Don't you have to work too?" She turned on the faucet to fill her cup. Her friend on the other end of the call was finally convinced. She hung up, and the hot water overflowed from the cup, scalding her hand. She yelped, dropping the cup as the water splashed everywhere. Instinctively, she stepped back, causing her cast-bound ankle to throb in pain. A hand reached out from behind, turning off the faucet. Jiang Yunxia was stunned and then found herself being lifted and placed on the edge of the sink. "Give me your hand." The icy voice above her startled her, and she obediently held out her hand. He held it under the cold water to soothe the burn. The cool water eased the burning sensation, and Jiang Yunxia, regaining her senses, couldn't help but glance up at him. From this angle, she could clearly see his long, dark eyelashes and the intense focus in his eyes. Jiang Yunxia's breath caught, her heart inexplicably fluttering. "Do you think that just because you're in a hospital, it's okay to get burned and treated right away?" His cold voice showed no emotion. Jiang Yunxia lowered her head and muttered, "Sorry." Jian Xiaodong glanced at her, unsure what he felt. "My name is not sorry." Huh. Jiang Yunxia was taken aback. "Is that all you can say to me?" She finally understood, almost blurting out sorry, again but held back, blushing furiously. She forgot to ask why he was there. The cause of her broken leg was ridiculous. Her new place was in an old neighborhood with wooden stairs that had to be navigated carefully. In a hurry, she had stepped too quickly and broken a step, falling down the stairs. When Jian Xiaodong took her home, the broken step was still there. He looked at it and then at her, his expression grim. Jiang Yunxia struggled to get out of the car, sheepishly saying, "I am not that heavy." Under 90 pounds, and she could still break a stair. She was exasperated too. Jian Xiaodong didn't comment on her explanation. He simply carried her, carefully avoiding the broken step as he walked upstairs. Jiang Yunxia stayed quietly in his arms, not daring to speak. In retrospect, today was probably the closest she had ever been to him. Even though they had lived under the same roof for 6 years, he had always been like the moon in the sky, beautiful but unreachable. The stairs were old and in disrepair. The restroom was shared by the entire floor, and even to boil water, she had to use an extension cord from the neighboring room. After seeing a few shady characters swaggering past downstairs, Jian Xiaodong finally lost his patience. "You need to move out of here." Huh. Jiang Yunxia was crouched by the old coffee table, pouring tea to show a bit of hospitality. She was confused by his words. He turned around, frowning coldly. "Do you want to end up on the front page of the news? This place is likely crawling with drug addicts and criminals. Haven't you read enough of such cases during our lessons? It's not that bad." She lowered her head, mumbling. Even she felt uncertain. She knew the place was dangerous, but this area had the cheapest rent in City A. Fresh out of school, she didn't have much money and had to make do. Jian Xiaodong didn't argue with her, simply stating, "Then move back to the apartment." "I don't want to." She almost immediately refused, lowering her head to avoid seeing his displeased face. "Then find a better place to live." His tone left no room for negotiation. Jiang Yunxia bit her lip and remained silent. Jian Xiaodong looked at her, his frown deepening. She seemed timid and easy to bully, but she had a stubborn streak. When her mind was made up, she adopted a submissive stance, but would not listen to anyone. A better neighborhood should be within your budget. Taking a deep breath, he softened his tone, something that would shock his colleagues at the firm. Jiang Yunxia didn't lift her head. Her neck's stubborn curve was evident. "That money isn't mine. I won't use it." The balance in her account was terrifying, with more zeros than she could count. All of it was transferred to her account by a lawyer after she came of age, as a gift from Jian Xiaodong's father. But she hadn't touched a cent, relying on part-time jobs to get through college. Even then, she felt indebted, especially with the bigger secret she harbored. An inexplicable irritation surged in Jian Xiaodong's heart as he frowned, not understanding her persistence. "If the will specifies that you're the beneficiary, does the firm have a rule against employees living in places like this?" Not wanting to argue further, Jiang Yunxia mustered the courage to interrupt him. "If not, then what right do you have to tell me to move, lawyer Jian?" Jian Xiaodong was taken aback by her counterattack. What right did he have? He had claimed they had no relationship, so why was he concerned for her safety? A smile played on his lips, but anger smoldered in his eyes. "Sorry, I overstepped, Miss Jiang." The moment the words left his mouth, Jiang Yunxia knew she had messed up again. She lowered her head, unable to think of anything to ease the tension. After a moment of silence, she heard the door slam shut behind her. He had left. She struggled to the window, holding the wall for support, and watched as his car drove away from the building. Before Jiang Yunxia met Jian Xiaodong, she had heard his name countless times. After her mother passed away, she was supposed to be sent to a nearby orphanage. However, Jian's father somehow found out about her and took her out of there. That's not a good place. The middle-aged man, with graying hair at his temples, squatted down and patted her head with a kind smile as he spoke. He found her a new place to live, arranged for her schooling, and covered all her living expenses. Later, she learned that all of this was because of her mother, the woman Jian's father had loved since his youth. He often came to visit her, asking questions about her mother, which she answered one by one. Occasionally, he would talk about his son with undisguised pride, always starting with, "Your brother Chiodong." Brother Chiodong. She remembered that name and everything associated with it. She knew he studied law and was an outstanding student. She knew he co-founded a law firm and had won several major cases, making a name for himself in City A. In her mind, she painted a picture of him as a righteous and kind hero from a storybook. But the first time she actually met him was at Jian's father's funeral. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and in the backlight, she saw his cold and frosty expression. When he took her away from the mourning hall, she instinctively reached for his hand, but he subtly avoided her touch. It was then she understood. He disliked her. After being a one-legged warrior for a long time, Jiang Yunxia finally had her cast removed. Before the end of the workday, Amon, a fellow assistant, leaned over and asked her, "Want to join us for dinner after work?" Jiang Yunxia was momentarily surprised, noticing Jian Xiaodong passing by the pantry. He seemed to have heard them and cast a glance their way. Since their argument in her rented room, he had hardly spoken to her for over half a month. But maybe she was overthinking it. They never had much interaction anyway. Snapping back to reality, she found Amon still waiting for her answer, so she nodded. "Sure, sounds good." As they were leaving work, it started to rain heavily. Jian Xiaodong stood at the entrance, seemingly waiting for someone. Jiang Yunxia and her colleagues walked out of the building. She quickened her pace as she passed by him. "Why are you walking so fast?" Amon, unaware, pulled her back and then turned to ask him, "Lawyer Jian, are you waiting for someone?" He looked down at her, his deep black eyes revealing no emotion. Jiang Yunxia lowered her head, feeling inexplicably guilty. "No," he replied curtly, opened his umbrella, and walked into the rain. Jiang Yunxia watched his back, feeling a strange sense of illusion. It seemed like he had been waiting for her. The so-called colleagues' dinner turned out to be with 3 engineers from the software company upstairs. During the meal, Jiang Yunxia quietly asked Amon, "Isn't this a matchmaking event?" Amon replied in a low voice, "Calling it a matchmaking event makes us sound desperate." That made sense, leaving Jiang Yunxia speechless. After dinner, they went to sing karaoke, staying out until 10 o'clock. The gentlemanly engineer opposite her escorted her to her building before leaving. Jiang Yunxia watched the car drive away before heading upstairs. The stairwell light was broken, and in the darkness, she saw the glow of a cigarette illuminating a handsome profile. Jiang Yunxia's breath caught, her throat tightening with the suddenness of it all. Why was he here again? "So this is why you won't move back to the apartment?" He stubbed out the cigarette and looked at her, his gaze seemingly full of meaning. Meeting men late at night, getting them to drop you off downstairs. If the relationship gets closer, coming up for tea would indeed be inconvenient." Unbelievable. Jiang Yunxia felt a surge of anger, looking up at him. Of course, not just tea, even if it was. His eyes narrowed dangerously, cutting her off. Even if what? Jiang Yunxia paused, taking a deep breath to calm herself before saying, "Lawyer Jian, what right do you have to question me?" "Right." The word seemed like a spell, his expression turning cold again as he looked at her. "Of course, I have no right." Jiang Yunxia lowered her head, planning to move past him to open the door. "That's good. But I didn't come here to argue with you." His cold voice came from behind her, and before she could react, the world spun around her. When she came to her senses, he had picked her up. Jiang Yunxia gasped, instinctively clutching his shirt. If you can get free, I'll let you stay here," he said calmly, carrying her downstairs. "Let me go." Jiang Yunxia was both angry and anxious, but her fists pounding on him couldn't move him. "What relationship do we have? What right do you have to control me?" The old building had poor sound insulation, and their argument echoed through the hall, causing an old lady to poke her head out. "Young man, keep it down while courting." Jiang Yunxia's face turned bright red at that comment, but she was stubborn, continuing to hit him. What right? Jian Qiudong didn't mind, pausing to look at her calmly. Jiang Yunxia, tell me, why did you steal a kiss back then? Jiang Yunxia froze, all her strength draining from her body. She opened her mouth, her heart racing, unable to speak. How did he know? Jiang Yunxia herself was unsure when she began harboring those hidden feelings for that person. But from the moment the seed was planted, the thought gradually grew into a massive vine in her heart, impossible to ignore. It was the summer after the college entrance exams. She had returned from a teacher appreciation banquet and was changing her shoes when she noticed he was also home. He was dressed in soft loungewear, reclining in the living room's rocking chair with his eyes closed, resting, a magazine open halfway in his hand. The world seemed to fall silent in an instant. She stood there, staring at him in a daze. The bit of alcohol she had consumed at the banquet seemed to turn into high-proof liquor, heating her blood and causing a roaring in her ears. She should have quickly returned to her room to avoid being seen by him when he woke up. But as if bewitched, she walked toward him. His eyes were closed, long eyelashes resting on his lower lids, looking serene and gentle, so different from his usual demeanor. He disliked her, very much so. This knowledge repeatedly surfaced in her mind, but she still couldn't control herself. She leaned down, closed her eyes, and cautiously kissed his thin lips. Soft and cool, like a too easily broken dream. But once she sank in, it was enticingly lingering. The afternoon breeze drifted through the silent living room, snapping her back to reality. Feeling like she had stolen a priceless treasure, she fled back to her room with a pounding, uneasy heart. The next morning, when she got up, his room door was already locked. The housekeeper told her that he had gone abroad for a while, but she didn't know for how long or for what purpose. That half-read magazine lay untouched on the side table until someone finally put it away. Even after being placed on the apartment sofa, Jiang Yunxia kept her head down, not saying a word. Take a day off tomorrow to move your things back. Jian Qiudong brought her a glass of water from the kitchen, but she didn't take it. He set the water on the coffee table and continued. Forget about the rent if it can't be refunded. Don't drag it out. Why? She finally spoke, but it was a question with no context. He didn't answer, just quietly looked at her, as if she were being unreasonable. You clearly dislike me. Jiang Yunxia bit her lip, her slightly red eyes revealing a hint of fragility. He instinctively looked away, avoiding her trembling shoulders, and said calmly, I have no reason to like you. His voice was flat, as if stating the most obvious fact, but it left Jiang Yunxia frozen. It felt like she was back at the funeral years ago. Little Jiang Yunxia reached out to hold his hand, but he just subtly moved away. Embarrassment and shame washed over her like a black tide, making her feel completely suffocated. He indeed had no reason. Living under the same roof, all his care for her was due to his father's dying wish. Despite his aversion, he couldn't go against his father's last request. But she had shamelessly accepted so much from the Jian family, still hoping for something more with him. It was simply disgraceful. Jiang Yunxia struggled to compose herself. After a long silence, she softly said, I'm sorry, I was overthinking. Jian Qiudong glanced at her, then looked away. A strange frustration arose in him, but even he didn't know where it came from. Time seemed to pass much more quickly after that. Jiang Yunxia found a more reliable apartment near the office and moved in. This time, Jian Qiudong said nothing. At the firm, he was the busy lawyer Jian Qiudong, and she was the diligent assistant. Their interactions were minimal. Perhaps she and Jian Qiudong were always meant to be like this. Without Jian's adoption, they would have been two completely unrelated paths. After a period of chaotic intersection, they ultimately extended in their own directions. Soon it was graduation. Jiang Yunxia took a 2-week leave to handle various matters back at school. One night, while out dining with friends, she was holding a beer can and feeling a bit tipsy when a classmate suddenly tapped her on the shoulder. She turned around to find a tall, nervous male classmate standing before her, holding a bouquet of flowers and almost unable to speak. "Yunxia, I like you. Will you be my girlfriend?" The cheers from her friends, the sound of passing cars on the road, the clinking of glasses, and the noise from the TV all blended together into a chaotic mess. Perhaps due to the alcohol, Jiang Yunxia, in her blurry vision, thought she saw a familiar figure standing in the distance. It was madness. Everything seemed to be about him. She cursed herself silently, squinting her eyes and looking at the boy before her. Amidst the haziness of drunkenness, she finally smiled gently. Sure. What was the harm? In the final wildness of youth, everyone held on tightly, and they dispersed into the night. The boy acted as a chivalrous guardian, unwilling to leave until he had seen her safely downstairs. Yunxia, She had agreed so quickly that it felt like a dream. He desperately wanted to hold onto something to prove the reality of the moment. He held her shoulders, nervously biting his lip. Jiang Yunxia looked at him dazedly, but her gaze suddenly shifted over his shoulder to someone behind him. The boy looked down, about to kiss her, but she abruptly pushed him away. The boy, confused, followed her gaze and saw a man standing under the street lamp, his deep, unblinking eyes fixed on them. Who is that? Jiang Yunxia bit her lip, hating the panic she felt at that moment. She forced herself to remain calm and said, "My brother." The boy wanted to say something more, but she stopped him. "Just go back for now." The boy looked at the two of them, sensing something odd, but didn't ask further and left obediently. As she watched him walk away, Jiang Yunxia turned to go upstairs, but the man reached out and grabbed her. When his hot hands touched her, she couldn't help but turn around and shout, "What exactly do you want?" The moment she spoke, tears began to stream down her face uncontrollably. Jian Xiaodong remained silent, quietly watching her lose control of her emotions. "Can't I like someone else? Must I like you? Even if I kissed you, so what? It was just a kiss. Just a kiss." He coldly repeated her words, though there was a hint of gritted teeth in his tone. "Yes, just a kiss." Before she could finish, she cupped his face, stood on tiptoe, and kissed him fiercely on his thin lips. He was stunned for a moment, but the next instant, she pushed him away mercilessly. Jiang Yunxia stepped back, wiping her lips harshly with her sleeve. "See, just a kiss. What's the big deal?" With that, she left him standing there in shock and turned to walk away. But just as she took a couple of steps, she was pulled back. The world spun around, and the next moment, his face was suddenly very close to hers. Her half-formed scream was swallowed as he kissed her passionately, his breath urgent and dominating, as if avenging the brief contact earlier. Beneath the cold facade, the kiss was searingly intense. When he finally let her go, the surrounding silence was profound. A distant street lamp cast a faint glow, illuminating only a small patch of their world. "Why?" Jiang Yunxia asked dazedly, not even sure what she wanted to know. Her heart pounded uncontrollably, as if an answer was on the verge of emerging. "Why?" Jian Xiaodong lowered his head, his dark eyes fixed on her. Beneath his cold demeanor was an unsettling emotion. "I also want to know why. I should hate you, shouldn't I?" She must think he's being absurd, as even he himself did. He should hate her. Yet, when she was harassed by some thugs and had to wait at the police station until midnight, he searched for her all night in the cold wind. Even after that, he arranged for a familiar driver to pick her up and drop her off from school every day, only then feeling reassured. He should hate her, but that summer, when she kissed him, he instinctively pretended to be asleep. If she had kept her eyes open then, she might have noticed that his hand gripping the armrest was unconsciously clenched. After returning to the country, he even avoided going back to his apartment and stayed in the suite at the top floor of a hotel. Yet, that cautious, almost tender kiss lingered in his mind, causing him restlessness and fear. He dared not confirm why that was, until she appeared in front of him again. Her flustered appearance when she met him, her intention to resign just to avoid working with him, and even moving out and returning the apartment key to him, All this urgency to distance herself from him made him inexplicably irritated. Not to mention how he felt when he saw she was living in such a place. Since taking charge of her, all her expenses, clothing, and living conditions were handled by him, all of which were fit for a wealthy young lady. How could she live in such a place? It had always been like this. Despite his hatred, he couldn't bear to see her suffer. Why? The question was about to be answered, but the person who caused it suddenly realized something and, in a panic, tried to turn and escape. He leaned in and firmly held her shoulders. Answer me, Jiang Yunxia. Why did you steal a kiss from me? Why didn't you let me keep hating you? Why did you disrupt him? Just one step away from the answer, Jiang Yunxia ran away. Her explanation was, I need to think about it. In reality, she had no idea what to think. Her mind was a mess, and her cheeks were burning. She rushed back to her apartment, splashed cold water on her face at the sink, and managed to calm down a bit. But then she thought about him. Was that a confession? Or was it just her overthinking and misinterpreting things? The repetitive thoughts and emotions kept Jiang Yunxiao up almost all night. The next morning, she woke up before her alarm even went off. After finishing her morning routine with a heavy heart, she arrived at the office building and was stunned when she entered the elevator. It was him. Probably because it was still early, the elevator was empty except for the two of them. The floor numbers ticked up one by one, but neither of them spoke. Finally, Jiang Yunxia broke the silence. About the questions you asked yesterday, she spoke softly. I've thought about the answers. Jian Xiaodong's breath caught, but he remained expressionless. I like you always have. She forced a casual smile to mask her nervousness. I know I'm terrible. I've already received so many favors from your family, and I know you dislike me. But still, I like you. I like you so much that, even if between us, he only took a small step, I'd be willing to traverse the remaining 99.5 steps. I like you so much that I can bravely lay bare all my feelings for you, without fear. Just like when we first met, I was the one who reached out first. I can keep liking you like this, but I want to know, when will this liking? Before she could finish her sentence, the elevator suddenly stopped, and the doors opened. People poured in, filling the small space with noise and commotion. Jiang Yunxia bit her lip, looked up at him with his unchanging expression, and felt frustrated. She wanted to know, when would this liking finally receive a response? As the elevator slowly arrived at their floor, it seemed that there would be no more opportunity to voice the remaining questions. She lowered her head, preparing to exit the elevator, when he suddenly reached out and took her hand. Just a simple interlocking of fingers, but the sudden action made her heart race. She stood there, stunned, as he guided her out of the elevator. Standing in the lobby, with people starting to fill the space, he showed no intention of letting go. Instead, he looked down at her with his dark eyes locked onto hers. Do you want to hear the answer? He said, the answer is now. He said, now. The person who had been tossing and turning with thoughts all night wasn't the only one. Throughout the long time, he had hated her, avoided her, but ultimately fell for her despite all efforts to escape. If everything was a predetermined outcome by fate, and he was destined to fall for her, then he had indeed wasted too much time. So, why not start from now? From now on, he would hold her hand. Jiang Yunxia was momentarily stunned, then realized this was the answer to her earlier question. She couldn't help but smile. She looked down and gently grasped his hand in return. From their first meeting until now, the hand she had reached out to was finally held by the one she wanted to hold.